let me back up a little bit from even just talking about who are these nature spirits that Merlin is talking to, because this is going to get into the idea of like what are fairies. And this is the thing I get asked probably the most on Twitter these days is like, do you really believe in fairies? What's going on with fairies?
Hello, everyone. This is Sarah from Hamilton, and I'm very pleased to be back with Richard Rohlin today to wrap up our discussion of That Hideous Strength and thus complete our discussion of the entire cosmic trilogy. So thanks again for coming on, Richard, and thanks so much for doing this series with us.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm very happy to be here.
In the last video, we got into some of the major themes of That Hideous Strength, which, unlike the first two books in the Space Trilogy or the Cosmic Trilogy, actually takes place on Earth. And so we kind of digest the celestial message, we might say, of the first two books, and then we enter into a world which is under diabolic occupation, and we know the truth behind it. One of the things that I wanted to talk about today is the way in which Lewis takes the kind of medieval picture of the world and the medieval conception of history and integrates it with his picture of the relationship of heaven to earth. So could you just explore a little bit with us about the way that the matter of Britain plays into this book and why Merlin is showing up in a science fiction trilogy?
Yeah. Okay. Lewis made a comment once. He said, when I was young, I sent a man to Mars in a spaceship. But when I became wiser, I sent him to Venus carried by angels. Right. And so there's this definitely kind of the sense that Lewis's science fiction was just never very like hard sci-fi to begin with. Definitely takes on these more and more mystical or more and more supernatural. Although I think Lewis would have really argued against that word supernatural in this context, but takes on this dimension. And so the idea is that he sort of like puts together a kind of a scientific basis in Out of the Silent Planet for the existence of angels, right? The Eldils, right? The Eldils, and he sometimes he'll say something like, oh, well, maybe they're not exactly the same things as what we mean by our guardian angels or something like that. But it's very clear that they are, like, because basically there are some Latin texts that are referring to them, and those are just texts that are talking about the bodies of angels, the ways that angelic powers have what we call subtle bodies.
Yeah.
So all that to say, if you're going to do a story about the dangers of scientism, right, where not the dangers of science, but the dangers of what happens when you take this outlook that sort of makes man the measure of all things, this outlook that sort of, that's not even the right way to say it, it's just this outlook that says modern science, right, we're going to continue progressing, and Lewis at some point said very explicitly in the introduction to that Hideous Strength that it's basically the explanation, or basically the working out of the second half of an essay of his called The Abolition of Man, right? Mm-hmm. And basically trying to show where was the progressivism and globalism of his time, where was that headed? Mm-hmm. So if you're going to oppose that kind of globalism that has no, it's the whole unburdened by what has been that our vice president is famously talks about, right? This idea that we're going to go on into the future and we're not going to carry any of the past with us, right? This idea that we get to write a new story, that we're kind of like a totally new, like a tabula rasa, like we're a blank slate, and we can just kind of like carve our own path in the future without any reference to history, tradition, all the pain that comes with those things, but also like all the beauty that those things have preserved. And in fact, the whole idea of like the objective room is to basically whittle that stuff down, right? And to basically grind that stuff out of you so that you become a blank slate open to what they call the macrobes, which are, again, obviously just demons.
Demons, right. Yeah,
Right.
for those who have read the book, because if you haven't read the book, I don't know why you're watching this right now. If you haven't read it in a while, the objective room is where Mark goes as he's being stripped of everything which makes him human. And I think one of the really striking things about the objective room is that it's not just horrific, right? So one of the things that is engraved on my memory is the way how on the ceiling there's this constellation of dots, which appears to be in random order, and yet it appears to have some kind of order to it, but you can't really make it out. And the sense that I think he's trying to get across here is that the way they're stripping Mark of his humanity is by stripping him of the idea that there's any kind of intrinsic order or form underlying the universe itself. And so when you're stripped of all that, then you can just be kind of, pure, meaningless, purposeless activity. So how then,
So let me answer your question about why is King Arthur involved in all of this.
Yeah.
By the way, just as an aside, I promise I will answer the King Arthur thing, but the objective room is a real thing that happened during the Spanish Civil War. You can look this up, but I believe it was the socialists in the Spanish Civil War who actually used rooms like this to torture prisoners. So it was something that actually happened within the 20th, late 19th, early 20th century.
Yeah.
And it's something really sinister to think about in terms of, I think later on, like the KGB, I've been to some KGB prisons that are now museums in Eastern Europe, and they have like very similar kinds of things, right? Stuff that's not just intended to torment you physically, but to break down your will in some way, right?
Yeah.
All right. So anyway, if you're going to fight against this globalist new thing, right, then the way to fight against it is against something that's local and also rich in history tradition, like something that's still like in the soil of the land that you're from. And so if you're British, that's the cycle of stories connected with King Arthur. And so this is what Lewis does, is he talks about this idea of the sort of awakening again of Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, but in a very kind of unexpected place and in a very unlikely guise. And so the Pendragon, right, which means the in British, that was just meant like the big dragon, the biggest dragon, the head of the dragon, kind of a thing. In other words, like the big guy, right? The Pendragon here is Ransom, who is now retired from his life as an Oxford Don, changed his name partly so I think the enemies of Logres, which is the idea of the real country within Britain, the enemies of Logres can't find him, and he's been affected by his time on Paralandra, so he's immobile now, more or less immobile because of his wound. He's a wound in his foot which won't heal, so he's like wounded like the Fisher King from Arthurian legend. But then he's also, in fact, that's his name, Mr. Fisher King. So he's wounded like the Fisher King from Arthurian legend, but then also he's ageless and basically incorrupt because of his time in Paralandra. So at the end of the story, he leaves to go back to Venus, to go back to Paralandra, where King Arthur also is, and there be healed, right? And so we get all this kind of stuff. But this is the idea that you have to get something that's local. So it's because the way to fight against globalism, which is this kind of leveling of the world, right? It's modernity doing to space what it's already done to time, which is like a leveling of all days. So there's a traditional experience of time that is, some days are more significant than others.
Yeah.
And even when St. Paul, when he's telling, his spiritual children not to get involved in like certain calendar disputes that were present in Second Temple Judaism, St. Paul would never for a moment think that Passover is just as important as any other day of the year, for instance. I mean, he talks about Christ, our Passover, is slain for us, therefore let us keep the feast, right? And so the ancient experience of time is that some days have a different character to them. Like some days you could say like the walls between this world and the next, or the veil between the seen and the unseen, however you want to express that. That maybe on some days that veil is thinner than others. Maybe on certain days you can really count on the intervention of a certain saint or something. But then also you make new days, right? Things that happen in history get caught up into eternity. And so, like, for instance, today in the OCA, we're celebrating the Pokrov, the protection of the Mother of God, which is on October the 1st. And the Pokrov is all about this idea that a thing happened in history. And it was such a significant moment that it was then caught up into eternity. And so the church is able to relive it, actually, to re-participate in it every year by keeping the feast. So that's the experience of time. But then there's also an experience of place. And the experience of place is, again, some places are more significant than others. So, for instance, the Holy Sepulchre is the most important place in the world in this paradigm. But then also some places are more important to me, and some places are more authentic or belong more truly to me than others.
Yeah.
Right. And so this idea of England or Britain as such, right? There's this idea of, well, Britain's become all of these things, right? The dark satanic mills and all that stuff. But within Britain, there's some kind of a true heart to the place.
Yeah.
Right. And so one of the things that Lewis is doing is it's actually very much a universal history move. And as I explained in our last video, even the title of the book comes from a work of universal history. So it's a very universal history move to kind of say, there's a real symbolic heart of Britain that is embodied by King Arthur and all the stuff around him. And then what he tries to do is say, what would it look like if that came forward into time where so much has changed? And so you have the St. Anne's group fellowship, or whatever you want to call them. You have the St. Anne's Fellowship, which is, here's what Arthur would look like translated, and all of that translated into like a modern fellowship of Christians gathered together to stop the tide of globalism and liberalism and all these other things. But then you also have someone untranslated. And because that person is untranslated, and this is Merlin, he's also extremely dangerous. And so much of the tension in the book, actually most of the tension in the book for me is always around Mark and, like his experience there at Bellbury. But much of the tension in the plot is, like the big thing you're looking for is like, when is Merlin going to pop up? And when he does pop up, whose side is he going to be on?
Yeah.
And because he was a Druid, because he was part of what's referred to as the old Atlantean circle, like the Druidic circle. So this idea that that Atlantis or Numenor, that Lewis uses Tolkien's idea of Numenor, which is certainly Tolkien's version of the Atlantis myth, uses it without Tolkien's permission, by the way, and misspells it because he'd probably never seen the word written down at this point. He just heard Tolkien read the stories to him. Tolkien was not actually amused by the way that Numenor made an appearance, and he was kind of like, but that was my thing, And Lewis does give him credit for it, but it does, by the way, though, it makes for a sort of fun, you can do like a Inkling cinematic universe kind of thing in your head, where you can be like, this is how Aragorn is connected to the event of that hideous drink or whatever.
There's so much there. I love the way that Lewis dives into the idea of particularity here, because when we think about, what is globalism about in this, why is it the enemy here? And it's because the way that it pursues the unity of things is by eradicating any kind of differentiation. And so it makes everything into an undifferentiated mass. There's no form or archetype which unites and makes things specifically what they are. And so when we talk, one of the objections people often have to there being such a thing as the Christian liturgical calendar is that, Christ has been raised from the dead. The resurrection permeates all things. And so now every day we should be feasting. And I think as far as that statement goes, it is true. Every day we should be feasting. And in the church, we do. But every day is infinitely and specifically itself, because
every day still has particularity. By the way, Christ did say, once I'm gone, my disciples will fast.
Yeah.
But you're right. Like every single day of the year, except for, I guess, Great and Holy Friday, is a feast set aside to something. Yeah. And we may not observe every feast in every place because part of the particularity. So the connective tissue between time and place is personhood.
Yeah.
right? And so you get that's why every Christian civilization, and by this regards, our country is still not a Christian civilization, but every Christian civilization has a Our Lady of this place,
Hmm.
right? But also you have certain major patron saints who are specific to certain locations and kind of put the stamp of their personhood on the experience of time and space, what it looks like to actually live and have your history tied with that, connected
Yeah.
with that place. And this is the idea of having a patron saint of a place. Now, the the part of the reason that I think Lewis goes to Arthur, and not there are some other movements that he could have done. I mean, there are, for instance, certain historical. Um, I mean, I think our King Arthur was certainly a historical person in some respects, but there were there are historical kings that he could have drawn on. It's curious to read a story that's about the real spiritual heart of England without a single mention of Saint George, for instance. That's all, very, that would be very bizarre by medieval standards. And this is, of course, because Lewis does have a real blind spot when it comes to these things. I think I said on Twitter the other day that if Lewis had slightly better sense, he would have made Malacandra Saint Michael. And of course, Melicandre is not Saint Michael. He's never come down to earth since the fall until the events of this book. But if Lewis had better sense, I think this would have done. Like, it's very obvious Melicandre is supposed to be Saint Michael, like symbolically speaking. He's the warrior. He's got the spear. He's the one that fought with Satan back during the time of the fall when Satan tried to take over the rest of the cosmos, and he's the one like the main sport on his planet is hunting like a big water dragon. I mean, come on, like this is very Saint Michael-esque kind of a thing. And Lewis didn't do that. Maybe it's better that he didn't do that because it opens up the book probably to more people. But there was a whole recent Saint Michael fracas on Twitter, which I'm sure you saw. That's what kind of had me thinking about it. But the thing about Arthur is that Arthur is not exactly the Arthurian stories are not secular. They're extremely, extremely Christian. But because they have a sort of legendary character about them, it kind of like sets them outside the specific confessional lines, and that it kind of opens up, makes them sort of like free game for lots of different kinds of people, right? Even though obviously Arthurian characters in the literature, they're constantly swearing by the Holy Virgin and like all this other stuff. They're very Catholic figures, but all of that kind of gets filtered out here for Lewis, which I think is, I don't know if it's to the detriment of the book or not. Again, probably it makes the book more appealing to certain people. I might never have read it as a young man, although I read a lot of pretty Catholic stuff, like the actual King Arthur stories when I was young. So maybe I still would have read it, but it does make it appealing to certain people that I think wouldn't read it otherwise. But I think that if I were going to write the story, which might or might not be any, it would probably be a much worse book if I wrote it. But if I were to write this story, I think that, the idea that, there are other powers, right, that are involved with Logris, that are involved with Britain, that have to do with the long and beautiful history of, and tragic at times, especially recently, history of Christianity in those isles. And I would want to work those in some way. So I don't know, but maybe I have some ideas for some stories that maybe we'll get to see in the coming years. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah. And one of the things that kind of strikes me in that vein is that the characters in the book, even when they're on Earth, they've never been out of the boundaries of the moon. They still hear Ransom call Jesus Maleldo, and that's one of the things that's always struck me as a little bit off. I mean, it makes sense in the universe of the story, but no, on Earth, his name is Jesus of Nazareth, because that is the name he has taken forever as a son of Adam. But at the same time,
this is the name that everyone's going to bow to, by the way.
Right.
But again, like in the sort of like blend of science fiction, Christian mythology, all the things that Lewis is doing, what he's doing there makes sense.
Right.
In the same way that Jesus being Aslan in Narnia makes sense.
Yeah. And that there is a kind of a person who lives in a vaguely Christian environment where they might feel like they understand Christianity very well. The moment they hear Jesus or, the Virgin Mary or Saint Michael, it has this kind of domestic quality. Like I know all my stuff. So when Merlin comes out of this place, he's a man of 2 or more worlds. He's a man of 6th century Britain. He's been taken into the present, but also, in really intriguing series of discussions here, Merlin is in concourse with powers which might be called magical, but also they don't quite fit into the categories of the occult in the absolute diabolic sense. So what is Lewis getting at here? What is Lewis's commentary on the old magic? And I think my audience should remember, Lewis was somebody who he acknowledges was fascinated with the occult. He felt the passion for the occult in an almost, lustful sense.
Yeah. And certainly had friends. I mean, the joke is that Out of the Silent Planet is Lewis doing an H.G. Wells novel, and Paralandra is Lewis doing a Lewis novel, and then That Hideous Strength is Lewis doing a Charles Williams novel. And he had a close friend, Charles Williams, who I think mostly unbeknownst to both Lewis and Tolkien until sometime after his death, Charles Williams was an occult master involved with at least 2 or 3 major occult groups, at least 2 that I know of, until the day that he died. This is not something that he ever renounced, and definitely had a sort of a fellowship like the one at St. Anne's, except that it took on these very dark occult dimensions. There was a lot of kind of like ritual sadomasochistic stuff with young women who were under his sway and everything else, and so of course I think Lewis was ignorant about most of that stuff, but he how do I put this? There's definitely a sense at a time or two when you're reading That Hideous Strength where it's like Jane wants to have a certain relationship with the director that she should not have, right? Mm-hmm. And then Lewis is like very quick to like squash that, and rightly so. And the way he does it is really good. It's handled well, but in the real version of what happened, that didn't happen. Like it was a really unhealthy relationship. So anyway. I have to say all that to say, Lewis definitely was adjacent to figures who were heavily involved in the occult, and I don't think Lewis himself ever, dabbled with that stuff. But anyway, it's something to be careful about. Not so much with Lewis's own writings, but certainly with Williams, who because of these reasons I cannot and do not recommend. Now, there's a reference to a Williams book, Taliesin through Logris. There's a reference to that in actually in That Hideous Strength, where it's a kind of like an in-universe reference to certain things having to do with King Arthur and Logris and all that stuff. And that collection of poetry is very weird. There is some good stuff in there, but in general, I don't recommend his novels. Okay, so let me back up a little bit from even just talking about who are these nature spirits that Merlin is talking to, because this is going to get into the idea of like what are fairies. And this is the thing I get asked probably the most on Twitter these days is like, do you really believe in fairies? What's going on with fairies?
The hot topic.
All of the, what's that?
Hot topic.
And then all these people will come in, it's usually a priest who will come in and quite rightly say, there's no such thing as neutral spirits, to which I agree. And I'll explain that the neutral spirit thing is actually a bad framing here in a second. But I wanted to start actually with St. Irenaeus and his demonstration of the apostolic preaching. Just to show how far this idea goes back in Christian theology. Of course, this is not new to St. Irenaeus. This is something he received from the apostles. It's something that they inherited from their sort of Second Temple Jewish frame. So you can certainly find things like this recapitulated in lots of other works. But here's the idea. But man, he that is God, formed with his own hands, taking from the earth that which was purest and finest, and mingling in measure his own power with the earth. For he traced his own form on the formation, that which should be seen should be of divine form. So as the image of God was formed, for as the image of God was man formed and set on the earth, and that he might become living, he breathed on his face the breath of life. For both the breath and for the formation, man should be like unto God. Moreover, he was free and self-controlled, being made by God for this end, so that he might rule all those things that were upon the earth. And this great created world, prepared by God before the formation of man, was given to man as his place, containing all things within itself. And there were in this place also, with their tasks, the servants of God, the servants of that God who formed all things, and the archon, the steward, sometimes translated, who was set over all his fellow servants, received this place. Now the servants were angels, and the archon was the archangel. Now this archon, he will explain, will fall out of envy and become the devil. And when he does so, some of the servants, that is these angelic powers, these, or let's say bodiless powers, who are there serving him and serving humanity, because it says when we were created, we were innocent, had childlike minds. And so the idea was that the steward would rule. See, this commandment the man kept not, but was disobedient to God, being led astray by the angel who for the great gifts of God, which he had given to man, was envious and jealous of him, both brought himself to naught and made man sinful, persuading him to disobey the commandments of God. So the angel, or the archon, becoming by his falsehood the author and originator of sin, himself was struck down, having offended against God, and man he caused to be cast out of paradise. It goes on to explain that Adam and Eve were initially naive and young, and so the rule of the world was given to the steward, or the archon, that is Lucifer, Satan, the devil, whatever you want to call him, and for him to rule until they had reached maturity, when they would take it over. And this is, of course, exactly the idea that we find in Paralandra that we talked about a couple of videos ago. So this is actually a really ancient Christian idea that you find all the way back in the Apostolic Fathers, and certainly predates them.
If you enjoy this content, please consider supporting this channel as a patron or paid Substack subscriber. I post reflections on Scripture 6 days a week, and 3 of these posts are exclusive to those who are patrons or paid subscribers on Substack at $5 per month. At $10 per month, patrons have access both to all of my written content as well as to weekly exclusive videos of about a half hour per week. At $30 per month, patrons have access to all of the preceding as well as a weekly class on the Old Testament of about an hour to an hour and a half each. Finally, at $35 per month, patrons receive access to all of my written and recorded exclusive content, as well as the ability to schedule monthly calls of 1 hour every month, as long as you remain a patron at this level. You can also access these benefits through channel memberships on YouTube. Please also consider purchasing my lecture sets, Answering Protestantism from the Bible, 17 hours, and Answering Calvinism from the Bible, 6.5 hours. These can be purchased either individually or together for a discount. All links are in the description box and pinned comment. Your support, both financially and especially through your daily prayers, is what enables me to produce regular, high quality, and original content. Thank you so much.
That being said, one of the things that most Christian, let's say, natural philosophers believed, from the ancient world, from ancient Judaism, all the way up to the Middle Ages and even the scholastics. When we say natural philosophy, nowadays that's what we call like the natural sciences, is that when they came across something, so there's this idea that God made the world to be ruled by these principalities and powers, angelic spirits, right? Who, yes, there are some who like would rule over like, you know, a certain nation or a certain location, but then also whenever they encounter something like a force in nature, right, they would, what we would say is there are regularly occurring natural laws which govern the way this thing functions, right? Whether it's like light or gravity or something like that, but even to say like there's a, you know, this tree is alive, or that you know, or this, you know, how do you know a river is a river? Like at what point does the Mississippi River become the Mississippi River? Like the Mississippi River is a body, it's got sources in all these different places, but at some point it has this identity of being the Mississippi River. So when we see those things, we try to explain them, and we try to explain that sort of emergence of particularity in the world by saying, you know, by basically defining it and measuring it. In the ancient world, when they come across things like this, they would define their particularity through the emergence of particularity through personhood. So remember what I said earlier about how the way that personhood is the thing that ties together like time and space, right? Well, in the same way, you when they saw, let's say, a natural force occurring, or like here's a forest, here's a river, here's a particular hill, etc. When the ancient world that they did, pagans did this, Jews did this, Christians did this, is to say there's a spirit involved with this, a daemon, or a daemon, or daemon, or or you could say an angel, right? And there are even like some Jewish scholastics, and by the way, there's such a thing as medieval Jewish scholasticism, by the way. Jewish scholastics would say, like, even in this conversation right now, that there's an angel of this conversation, right, that you and I are having, something like that. Which is to say, like, that sounds like a weird way for us to phrase it, but if I said there's a spirit of this conversation that we're having right now, then most people would, I think, kind of grasp at what I'm saying. And so this is the idea that the world works because God created angels to function as servants to basically run certain aspects of creation. Now, some of those spirits have fallen. It is very difficult, actually, to talk about when angels fall, because angels exist in something like aeonic time, which is the same sort of existence that like mathematical principles or the world of forms or something like that has. Mathematic principles, like the idea of like the triangle, right? Well, that exists within created time because triangles are not uncreated, right? But they also aren't subject to like decay, right? And so they're not in chronological time; they're in what the fathers called aeonic time. But angels also exist in this kind of time. So what it looks like for an angel to fall, when an angel falls, from their perspective and their experience, it's like, you could say, this is why sometimes you'll have somebody say like, oh, Satan fell the moment he was created, or something like that. And in a certain way that's true, but the way that it kind of like crosses over, right, into man's experience of chronological time. Now, what I'm saying here, this is not really speculation. This is, on my part anyway, you'll find this in St. John of Damascus, for instance, when he talks about the nature of the, what angelic nature is and how they relate to time. You can also find this in like Losky and other more recent Orthodox writers, but this is the basic idea. So in our experience of time, you definitely find early on in the fathers that maybe there were like multiple falls of the angels. This is something Father Stephen DeYoung, Father Andrew Stephen Damick talked about on the Lord of Spirits podcast from time to time. The idea that maybe there's, our experience in time, in chronological time, is of kind of these multiple falls taking place. And so one of the things that seems to have happened is that humanity started giving worship, right? And so we know that now we're going to get into speculative territory. Okay, so this is my kind of way of trying to explain what's going on here. Is that, we know that most human civilizations start out as kind of like worshiping one, sky father, like this heavenly, sky father, kind of a deity. And then as they proliferate, like and develop technology over time, that the pantheon gets split up into more and more and more gods. Yeah. And actually, the more developed civilizations become, like, people have this stupid idea because of our 19th century German, scholars of religion. That things begin in polytheism and move towards monotheism. But this is actually simply not the case. The more developed and articulate a civilization becomes, the more gods they have. And so eventually this kind of splits, and so you go from like worshiping the sky. Now you have the sky and the earth, but then also you have like ways of describing different things, like other things. And so like the spirit of this river, or the spirit of this tree, you could say, which might actually be the angelic body, or the angelic principality that is supposed to govern this particular body, or this particular expression of particularity in nature. Well, now we start ascribing worship to that spirit. And it definitely seems like, certainly, some of these spirits fell, or at least there are demons who are happy to come in and take that worship upon themselves. So, and this is how you get, the idea of like all these little gods, like the little god of this particular forest, or little god of this particular river or rock, or something like that. So the question then to ask is, one, how far down does this sort of progression of intelligences go? right? And it's very clear that, for instance, like whatever spiritual principle, I mean, and just by the way, like this is biblical too. In the Old Testament, in the New Testament as well, you have things like angels who gather, like control the four winds of the earth and things like this,
Yeah,
right? So,
the elemental spirits.
yeah, the elemental spirits, right? So the question is like, how far down does this sort of chain of being go, and to what degree are those things conscious or unconscious, and to what degree can you or should you interact with them?
Yeah.
And there's a very, very particular argument that it is important to understand and follow, and it's the one that Mr. Dimble gives to his wife when he's kind of like going on and on, she wants to go to bed or whatever. But he's talking about, and he talks about the way that everything in the world is always becoming sharper and like more particular.
Right.
And so you can like look back in time and say things used to be a certain way, but you can't do that anymore. And one of the things that he uses as an example is polygamy. Mm-hmm. Now, polygamy exists in the Old Testament, and for like Abraham or something like that. And the interesting thing is that while we definitely say, sure seems like in every example ever given of polygamy, it doesn't work out very well, and all these other reasons why polygamy is a bad idea, but God never tells Abraham, not to do that, and so it's just, but now if you tried to go back and decide I'm going to reinvent polygamy, as many cult leaders have and do, right, then what you find is that you definitely can't do that without it being broken, sinful, and destructive, right? And so it's not to say, I'm not making any judgments about Abraham, by the way. Like, I think it's actually really annoys me when people are like, oh yeah, look at all these guys in the Old Testament, they're just as sinful as I am. It's like, show a little respect. This is your father in the father of all the faithful. Whatever he did and didn't do right, it's not for me to judge Abraham. Gosh,
yeah,
I can't even imagine like thinking that you could. Anyway, so it's certainly not for me to judge Abraham, but the thing that makes Abraham the father of the faithful is his obedience to God. But then once the law is given, well, now things have kind of narrowed to a little more of a point. So what it looks like to be a faithful follower of the God of Israel now does not mean, as you travel along, just build altars and sacrifice whenever you want to, which is what Abraham did. Well, now there's actually a particular place you're supposed to sacrifice, right? And so things change a little bit. And then once the temple gets built in Jerusalem, it becomes specifically Zion, the city of God. So things get narrowed again to a point, and so
you can't move it,
right? And you can't move it. And if you had and at that point, if you decide, as somebody did, I'm going to go set up a worship to Yahweh. I mean, that's like the golden calves in Dan and Bethel that they make. They are saying this is Yahweh, the God of Israel, and they're like basically taking like an Egyptian fertility cult, kind of mixing it all in together, and saying, listen, you don't have to walk so far to church. Right, that's basically what they're saying. It's like, we've made a seeker-friendly form of the worship of Yahweh, the God of Israel. And of course, God completely rejected that, because now the only right place to come and offer sacrifice is actually in Jerusalem. So things kind of keep narrowing to a point. And they narrow to a point, of course, in this respect, all the way up to Christ, and then everything kind of just explodes outward again. But so the idea then is that you have somebody like Merlin who has these ties back to Atlantis or Numenor or the True West or whatever, and he is a Christian of a sort, a Christian from 6th century Britain, and so that implications of certain things are different. But he is a Christian. He's a king's man. I love that famous line that some guy said during the Reformation when he was defending Merlin's well in the book, and then like the king's men came to kill him, which I won't repeat on your channel because it has mild profanity in it, but it's a very lovely line actually. But anyway, talking about Merlin. So Merlin is this kind of this liminal figure who has these connections to kind of like the magic of the old world. And there was definitely this idea that people had during the conversion of the British Isles. And it was like, on the one hand, all the Druids have to convert, right? But then on the other hand, maybe there was this idea that there was some there were certain elements of like Druidism and certain elements of like the bardic tradition and everything that had prepared the people, you know, in the same way that Greek philosophy prepared the Greeks, etc., had actually prepared the British people for Christ.
Yeah.
Now, two things to say about this. One is that there's an element of this that is certainly true, and you find this, for instance, in the tales of the colloquy of the elders of Ireland, or as my friend Dr. Marshall calls it, Old Men Talking, which is a book Jonathan Pageau and I are going to do a universal history video on soon. But it's basically this idea of St. Patrick meets the last two remaining heroes from the golden age of Celtic paganism. And he sits down with them. He's like, tell me the stories. And they tell the stories and all the things about who had the best drinking horn. And here's this amazing cattle raid that I went on, and who had the best horses and all this different stuff. And at some point, St. Patrick is like, man, I don't know. Should we actually be talking about this? Is this keeping us from our prayers? And his two guardian angels show up, because everyone knows St. Patrick has two guardian angels.
Mm-hmm.
They show up and they're like, no, it's okay. Anything bad will be forgotten. That's the idea, is like the good stuff is going to be carried forward by the church. So there is that side to it. There was also, though, in Lewis's day, this, and it has to do with the whole kind of red herring, as it turned out, although no one at the time realized that maybe, but this idea of British Christianity. And so there were people who were trying to say, it basically has to do with like the Anglo-Catholic revival, and people trying to say, oh, there's actually this really beautiful tradition over which papism never had any control, but we can basically have all of our Catholic elements, but without the Pope or Rome, or there was definitely a kind of a how do I put this? There was definitely an idea that the people of the British Isles, they're robust, hardworking, etc., and then the Italians and the other people from the Mediterranean area, they're kind of corrupt, decadent, lazy, you know, untrustworthy, etc., etc. So there was definitely like some kind of racial sort of things going on there, where they say, well, we don't want anything Italian having to do with our good English religion. But what they tried to do is then say, oh, actually, there's a tradition of religion in England that goes back to even before Rome.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where the idea of like Joseph of Arimathea coming to the British Isles and all this stuff originally comes from. And that really becomes important during the time of Queen Elizabeth the First. But by Lewis's day, this had taken a particular bent, where there were people who were saying, and certainly they were wrong about this, but they were saying things like, oh, the doctrine of the Trinity was already completely and fully extant within like Celtic Druidic religion and things like this. And so Lewis is definitely kind of taking some of those things in here in the picture that he's building of Merlin, except that he doesn't make the mistake of making Merlin like really sanitary, which is what these people would have done.
Right.
He does have Merlin like as very much this, here's the untranslated thing from the Arthurian legend, like come forward into time with all of the terrifying and it's actually the character of Merlin is so well done in this book that it's staggering to me. So the idea is that he's someone who has opened his mind and engaged in connections with these lower principalities. Now, what are these lower principalities? Are they what you would call fairies? Well, I don't actually think that there's, and here I'm going to say my bit on fairies. I don't actually think there's any particular one kind of thing that you could nail down and say, this is fairies and this is the one category fairies fit into. There were medieval explanations for fairies, the most common one being that they're these sort of the angels who fell halfway, right? The angels who didn't choose God, they didn't choose Satan, and now they don't belong in heaven or in hell, right? And the ones who are kind of in between. But the point is that, remember what I said about the aeonic time versus chronological time, the way those things cross over. So from our perspective, you know, so in every instance, and there are many well documented instances of fairies appearing to people. Fairies always ask the same question when they meet a Christian, which is, will we be saved on Judgment Day? And the answer to this, by the way, is always whenever they meet like a layperson, the layperson's always like, I don't know, get me out of here. Why is this happening to me? But whenever they meet a bishop or a priest, the answer they're always given in these stories is, basically they ask, is there repentance for us? Is there a way that we can be saved? And the answer is always that can't be known until Judgment Day. And so there is this idea that's very traditional of the idea of spirits that are not really neutral, because nothing in the cosmos is really neutral, but certainly the idea of spirits whose status from a human point of view, and maybe even from their own point of view, is a little dubious, or it's a little uncertain.
Mm-hmm.
And in the older days, there were people who interacted with them in certain ways to augment their power in the world, and it was not really okay then.
Yeah.
As Ransom says, but it's definitely not okay now.
Yeah.
So this is like, but Merlin, because he's somebody who is, who did interact with those spirits in that way, Merlin is the ideal vessel and the sort of the weapon that they need to overthrow the Belbury crowd.
A good man, but not too good.
Yes, a good man, but not too good. Yeah, not a saint.
Yeah. And so this is kind of where that hideous strength makes it absolutely clear that we're living in we the reader are here living in the same narrative universe of the first two books, because, as always happens, the way in which the diabolic project is ultimately thwarted is he himself makes a crucial error of judgment, makes a critical mistake, opening a door through which he himself is going to fall through and throw his whole project to the wind. And that's what happens here with Merlin, who is now the appropriate vessel through which, he's consorted with the lower powers. But now there are these higher powers who couldn't enter our world before. But because the enemy, by his own will and plot, broke through the boundary at the moon's level in order to go, in one sense, to Mars, in a fuller sense, to Venus, would you tell us what does it look like when the gods of deep heaven descend through Merlin to meet the terrestrial powers? On the one hand in St. Anne's, at the other hand in Belbury. And then could you give us some thoughts, however speculative you want to make them, on the way these literary constructs may or may not have a genuine analog in the concrete structure of the real universe?
Oh, geez. Okay. All right. So the way that it happens in the book is a little vague. It's, to me, actually one of the unsatisfying parts of the book. In his book, Planet Narnia, Michael Ward makes this amazing argument for the way that the symbolism of the different planets, the medieval symbolism of the different planets, makes its way into Lewis's writing, especially in this scene. Mm-hmm. The scene where the planets are descending and then kind of investing their power in Merlin is amazing. The payoff for that, in my opinion, is one of the weaker parts of the book, because basically what happens is Merlin puts the curse of Babel on the people at Belbury in a really good scene. But Babel, dealing with language, well, that's Mercury, or I forget his name in Old Solar, but
Veratrilbia.
Yeah, Veratrilbia. There we go. Well, that's Mercury, is language, but then, like, where do we see the other powers actually kind of come in? And so it's basically kind of vaguely indicated that the whole Braxton College, Belbury, everything gets destroyed in like an earthquake and a flood. So there's the idea of like a small scale recapitulation of the flood and the Tower of Babel, like those two things happening. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of the closest that we get. And it is not clear to me, and I think this is one of the flaws in the book that Lewis doesn't really pay off, is why you would need the powers of these, massively powerful archons to affect such a localized miracle, when it's not at all difficult to imagine your average Celtic saint pulling the same thing off, with with the help of the demons that he trapped in pots or whatever,
Yeah.
like it's so that's one of the things to me that doesn't really so much pay off in the book. But maybe there are like spiritual dimensions. It's definitely indicated that the macrobes, which is what the Belbury people call the demons, that they're protecting or trying to protect their servants in some way, but then as soon as their tools become useless to them, they immediately turn on them and start to feed on them. And that's actually what causes the chaos and causes everybody at Belbury to just start fighting and killing each other, which happens right after the Curse of Babel. So that's, but to me, it's one of those things that's not, I'm not totally satisfied with the sort of the denouement of the book. So as far as whether or not such things exist, like these archons, their role in the world today, etc. I mean, Lewis's structure for this is so deeply compelling, and it works so well with the medieval cosmology, which I've deeply internalized in a lot of ways, that it's very difficult for me not to be convinced by it. That being said, what we do know without a shadow of a doubt is that demons are real, that angelic powers are real, that certainly angelic powers govern planetary bodies as well as things on this earth, and some of them are evil and some of them are good. The most important ones for our purposes are those who have been given a role in the story of our salvation, such as the holy archangels. And I feel like if I were to try to figure out at what level at what level do the where do the in the traditional nine ranks of the angels, like where do the like archons like Malacandra, Paralandra, where do they factor in? It seems like they probably at the realm of like powers or thrones, somewhere in there. There's like power, throne, dominions, maybe somewhere in there. And we're told by the Holy Fathers that the 7 holy archangels, that they're not part of the rank that's called archangel, but they're actually something set apart above the rest of the host of heaven. So like Michael as the leader of the host of heaven, like he's the leader of God's armies, and Gabriel as God's herald, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And so it's certainly the case that in sort of your average Christian experience, when I say average Christian experience, I mean most Christians across time, not your average modern evangelical American experience, but that most Christians across time, and actually the Jews before them as well, had experiences of these angelic powers, the holy archangels, Michael and Gabriel. It's not like when St. Luke was writing his gospel, there's like, and then the archangel Gabriel appeared to Mary, and he's like, oh, by the way, you've never heard of the archangel Gabriel before. Let me explain. There's this archangel, his name is Gabriel, blah, blah, blah. Well, no, everybody in Judaism already knew who the archangel Gabriel was, because he'd come to Daniel, right? Because he'd appeared at these other times, right, in the history of Judaism and in these various apocalyptic texts. Like everybody knows who Gabriel is. And so we actually have interaction on a regular basis with in our prayers, in the life of the church, and just the way that the angels accompany Christ in the divine liturgy. I mean, our patron saint, mine and yours, Saint Seraphim of Sarov, when he was a deacon, by the way, he was ordained a deacon the same year that the American Constitution was ratified. One of those things has been better for the world than the other. But anyway, he as he was serving as a deacon, he had an ecstatic experience, and he saw Christ entering the church right at the time of the Trisagian hymn. And he saw Christ enter the church accompanied by an army of his angels, right? And so in the divine liturgy, in our prayer life as Christians, all these different things, in the Orthodox Church, every Monday is dedicated to the Archangel Michael and the other bodiless powers, etc. We have interactions with these vast cosmic entities who see themselves actually as our fellow servants. And so it's interesting to speculate like what's going on with for instance, what's going on with Jupiter or something like that. And I think there's definitely something to what Lewis has kind of laid out. But for me, the real I get more satisfaction from my my relationship with these things, like within the life of the church, than I do from kind of maybe like speculating on this. Now, I think it would be fun to write some novels, kind of using this general setting, and maybe making a few tweaks. But yeah, that's a discussion for another time.
Yeah. In that exposition, it reminds me in a real sense of the experience that Jane has before she becomes fully Christian.
Yeah.
With Venus. She
Yeah.
Venus as this kind of foreign power, which is frightening. She doesn't
really
know what to
dangerous.
make of it. But at the end of the book, how does she experience the same power? She experiences the same power in the rectification of her domestic situation, because the celestial powers have been, and I mean this word in a very precise sense, domesticized within the house, which is the church.
That's right.
And that is a fundamentally different relationship that we have with the same powers than one you might have if you live outside of Christ, looking up at the heaven.
And the other thing that I think is missing from Lewis's vision, although he gets there in Paralandra, but he maybe, because of his Protestantism, sort of fails to see how it's already also happened on Earth, right? Is although with Ransom, like Ransom is basically like a living saint, right? And so he has converse with the heavenly powers and all this different stuff. But this idea that as humans become divinized, right, as humanity becomes sanctified, we start taking the roles, right, that were left over by the rebellious powers. We actually take those roles over. And this is why St. Paul says, don't you know that you're going to judge angels, etc., this idea of the divine council. So we actually take those roles over. And that's why, again, I'd have loved to see, like it's great that all of these powers from outside of the moon came down and enabled Merlin to go wreck these very stupid scientists, but I feel like St. George could have easily handled that project. So anyway, maybe don't know how you'd have I have some ideas about how you could tell a story like that, where there would still be kind of suspense and St. George wouldn't just seem like a deus ex machina or whatever. Like I said, we'll have to save that for another time. Maybe someday I'll write that novel.
May it be. Well, thank you so much, Richard. I've really enjoyed this whole series of discussions, and this one in particular. I love these books, and you've brought a huge amount to the table that I really hadn't considered before, and I hope my audience can say the same. So by God's will, you'll come back on to talk about something else.
We'll figure it out.
All right. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
If you enjoy this content, please consider supporting this channel as a patron or paid Substack subscriber. I post reflections on Scripture 6 days a week, and 3 of these posts are exclusive to those who are patrons or paid subscribers on Substack at $5 per month. At $10 per month, patrons have access both to all of my written content as well as to weekly exclusive videos of about a half hour per week. At $30 per month, patrons have access to all of the preceding as well as a weekly class on the Old Testament of about an hour to an hour and a half each. Finally, at $35 per month, patrons receive access to all of my written and recorded exclusive content, as well as the ability to schedule monthly calls of 1 hour every month as long as you remain a patron at this level. You can also access these benefits through channel memberships on YouTube. Please also consider purchasing my lecture sets, Answering Protestantism from the Bible, 17 hours, and Answering Calvinism from the Bible, 6.5 hours. These can be purchased either individually or together for a discount. All links are in the description box and pinned comment. Your support, both financially and especially through your daily prayers, is what enables me to produce regular, high quality, and original content. Thank you so much.